Okay, it's a couple minutes after the hour, so I think it's about time to get started. I'm Harry Hockheiser, Director of the MIDAS Coordination Center, and I want to welcome you to the September 2021 edition of our monthly webinar. Thank you all for joining in. Today we have a talk we've been looking forward to for a while. We have Dr. Anna Bento, Assistant Professor in Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the School of Public Health at Indiana University, Bloomington. I guess I should say the relatively new School of Public Health at Indiana University. Dr. Bento is a disease ecologist with a focus on ecology and evolution of infectious diseases. She earned her PhD in ecology and evolution at Imperial College London, did an MRC postdoctoral fellowship there as well, and then worked at the Odum School of Ecology at UGA. She uses theoretical models to understand how humans and other animal systems behave while simultaneously seeking to confront and validate models with data and make predictions. So we're looking forward to hearing what Dr. Bento has to say. I want to, before I let the speaker begin, I want to mention that we do have interpretation available. If you're interested in hearing this talk in Spanish, you can click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the Zoom window and select Spanish there, and you'll hear the translated version. With that, I want to thank Dr. Bento for joining in and hand it over to her to take away the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Thanks for the kind introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about a coupled system model that deals with both disease progression and also economic consequences, looking at trade-offs that may occur during different types of control strategies. So most of the pandemic, a lot of people had time to start new hobbies, and thus I decided to start learning economics. So that was kind of like my pandemic new skill. But in all honesty now, we know that the COVID-19 pandemic, the global repercussions actually expose the need for coupled systems frameworks that actually link epidemiological and economic models to assess these disease economy trade-offs that we've been hearing very much since the beginning of the epidemic in all countries and the pandemic globally. So such frameworks can reveal important features of control strategies, such as the role of particular targeted isolation that could potentially overcome coordination failures between how infectious and susceptible individuals interact and thus drive economic recession. So I'll get into more details further on, but the idea is that we have a dynamic, forward-looking model that looks at consumption, meaning the dollars you spend, how you pass your time, and labor and leisure choices, so how much you work and how much you go out to go about your life. And all of these decisions and choices account for the risk of infection that can be made by two different channels. One, a voluntary type decision where everybody does what they want, or through coordinated policy interventions that range from a blanket lockdown that we have, of course, experienced early on during the pandemic, through targeted isolation measures, which are the ones we are mostly exploring in our models. So I mentioned that I was learning economics, but that would have not been possible without my amazing collaborators who are all economists and were incredibly patient with me. And one of them happens to be my big brother, Antonio Bento, who's at USC, and his student Thomas, and then Daniel Kaffin, who's at Colorado Boulder, and my partner in crime, Akil Rao, who's actually in the audience. So if there's incredibly hard economics questions, I will attempt, and then I'll probably deflect and have him come and rescue me. So as I mentioned, this is a coupled epi-economic model. And the first question that we were asking when we started talking to each other as we started a collaboration was, do we believe people will walk over a dead body to go to work or to go to a party? And what does that mean? It means, what kind of risk are people willing to take to continue their lives as they are? So our model has, in essence, 3 layers. The first layer is every day, and especially during a pandemic situation, people make decisions by looking at the state of the world. So that translates into dollars consuming goods and doing activities, and time spent in these activities, as well as the amount of time they spend working, which is earning the money. So these economical decisions are hand in hand, of course, with epidemiological realities and risk decisions. There are these inherent trade-offs that happen with everyday contacts. So how much do you contact, and how does that translate into these activities? So contacts are basically the baseline and the bones of our model, because contacts are critical to map decisions on hours worked and dollars spent, and that actually is not that trivial. So then we have the second layer, which means that in order for us to anticipate the tomorrow, what today looks like actually affects our expectations. So how much we know kind of dictates what we can expect. And the third layer, of course, is what most of us end up looking and trying to design is policies. So designing these policies and instruments that control disease, but also look into economic effects are crucial now more than ever. So our models try to capture these key elements, looking at disease transmission, and the model that I'm presenting today is calibrated to SARS-CoV-2, but with the R naught of the wild type. But of course it can flexibly be changed, but most importantly, it carefully considers these micro foundations that govern individual decisions. And these are, as I mentioned before, how you spend your money, what activities you choose to do you go to work or do you stay home? So we embed these individual decisions and disease dynamics into this economy-wide framework. So I like pretty pictures, and so I'm going to kind of walk you through in a more visual way exactly what I just said in the previous slide. So in our model, we have individuals that make consumption and labor decisions and consider the risk of infection through contacts with others. So individual economic choices drive population level outcomes such as disease prevalence and economic recessions. So those are the two main outcomes that we explore in our model, and they go hand in hand and illustrate the potential trade-offs. So we calibrate the model with labor market decisions, economic activity mapped to epidemiological contacts, risk aversion, so how willing am I to do a certain activity given the awareness that I have of, for instance, the burden in my community. And we have these calibrated risk reward trade-offs based on a very simple economic metric called the value of statistic life. So the value of statistic life is basically a measure that looks at local trade-off between mortality risk and money. So how much are you willing to earn, to spend, given that you have a particular risk to die? So this value of statistical life does reflect this private willingness to pay for a very small reduction in mortality risk. So this is actually a concept that is micro-founded in microeconomics, which is where, of course, I spent a lot of time learning, and my collaborators were amazing in kind of allowing us to integrate these very complex metrics. So transmission part is also calibrated with COVID-19 parameters, as I mentioned before. So here we have two different types of interventions. We have the decentralized, which means that they're voluntary decisions, so everybody does what's best for them. So this is grounded in the general equilibrium behavior model, which is a typical way to solve decisions in economics models. And in this case, as I mentioned before, individuals optimize their behaviors based on their own preferences and knowledge of their health status. So we know that some may isolate and some will not, depending on how risk averse they might be. So under these coordinated interventions, which is the other type of intervention we explore, individuals' behaviors are now optimized based on how they affect population level outcomes. So we can have two different types of interventions, which we're going to explore today, which is the blanket lockdown, which of course is the working horse of transmission mitigation when we don't know much about a novel epidemic or an epidemic took off very fast. Or we can have this targeted isolation, which is what we're going to explore more in detail here today, where the idea is that this entity or a planner, as the economists call them, makes decisions to maximize population level outcomes. So in the model that we are developing here, of course, we are maximizing for minimizing the recession while still controlling the epidemic. And thus these optimal policies may emerge depending on what you are maximizing. I mentioned a few times now already that what basically is the link between these two types of modeling approaches is really the mapping of the contacts. So contacts are a function of economic activity here. Of course, in epidemiology, in infectious disease modeling, we've been working with contact matrices for many years now. So this is not the novel part of this work. They tend to be age-structured contacts where we have an average of daily contacts within your age class, between your age class, and of course, through different activities. And in fact, we use to adapt into our own matrices, we used Premetal matrices prior to pandemic. And basically what we did, we constructed these age-structured contact matrices and kind of assigned them to consumption contacts, labor contacts, and of course, unavoidable contacts. We then, as per usual, use a next generation matrix method to calculate mean number of contacts adjusted to how individuals of different ages might mix. But then what we do is we end up collapsing these age classes such that we can now map them to these economic activities and to the economic metrics that exist at the population level to calibrate them in a more tractable way. So today our model will not really explicitly model structure in age, but that's definitely something we are now working on, which I will present maybe at another time. So the idea is that we use these contacts to map to labor supply and to dollars spent and hours in contact function. So now we have the daily contacts and we translate that into dollars and into hours of contact. And this allowed us, of course, to calibrate to the R naught that we thought it was appropriate for the model. And this approach provides a behavioral grounded perspective on why contacts occur and understanding the structure and benefits of targeted isolation, which I'll present in a little bit. So we know that in the US economy, the average individual has about 7.5 contacts in their place of work during an 8-hour workday. So these are avoidable contacts that individuals can alter by changing their labor supply. But of course, we know that there are unavoidable contacts, such as household and some community contacts that are, of course, unavoidable. So in this work, contacts are critical. And mapping the econ hours spent and dollars spent into these epidemiological concepts that we've been exploring for many years was really the biggest contribution in terms of the mechanics of the model. So we allow contact mapping to fluctuate endogenously. And what I mean by this is that we allow individuals to adjust their number of contacts either through consumption labor, depending on how they perceive their own health status and of course the community health status to make these decisions. And so we don't have mechanical jumps or cuts in average contacts, but we have them smoothly changing over time. So the model here is, as I mentioned before, not looking at heterogeneity in ages, but we do map economic heterogeneity that hopefully accounts implicitly for some of that. But of course, we don't have, different old versus young type of willingness to supply labor and money spending. But hopefully you'll see that that's something that is very easy to then change. So the idea is that we change labor contact parameters and allow people to decide over time. So because this wouldn't be a MIDAS presentation without some equations, and I'm just kind of like showing you a little bit of the under the hood. So we have a SIR model with death, mortality. So this is a simple general equilibrium framework from the economic point of view. So consumers work and earn income so they can actually spend money. From the epidemiological point of view, it's a deterministic discrete time dynamic optimization where each period is 1 day. So the framework assumes that individuals have full information about their health status, and the presence of pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic individuals is reflected in the calibration of productivity loss, as only individuals with no or very mild symptoms will be willing to work in the voluntary situation. A few slides ahead, we'll play with the friction of not knowing your health status or delayed health status, and also the willingness to abide by some rules. So the model solves the dynamic optimization problem and balances risk and activity, and then aggregates solution across the population, allowing us to direct calculate disease economic trade-offs. So,
Anna,
yeah.
there's a question here from Kat Shea. Do you minimize the recession while satisfying the control of the epidemic, or do you do some sort of joint optimization, for example, multi-objective optimization?
So the first, so we minimize the recession by controlling the epidemic. But I think because this is a little bit more, it's a detailed question, Kat, I would really much enjoy having a conversation either during the answer question session or maybe afterwards offline. We can definitely talk about that in more detail, if that's okay. All right, so let me get into a little bit of the voluntary versus targeted responses. So the main concept here from the economics point of view is the utility function that we incorporate. So we have this constant elasticity substitution, which kind of allows people to change their behavior accordingly over time. So individuals can maximize their lifetime utility function, meaning that they can make decisions that are good for them, and these decisions are purposeful. So under the voluntary response, individuals choose consumption and labor, and basically their expected future utility depends on their awareness of their present utility. There's one budget constraint here where you earn the needs, your earning needs to be higher than your spending. So in our case, in our model, individuals do not have savings. And there's an expectation over the future, meaning that what happens to you today affects what you'll do tomorrow. So what that means is that if you are susceptible, if individuals are susceptible, they affect their choices of consumption and labor here, and they affect what happens the next day. Of course, if you are recovered, then this is constant and it doesn't really change. But the idea is that we have this recursive optimization problem, of course, not steady state because we have these things changing over time, that captures this purposeful adaptive behavior. So each individual does what is best for them and make informed decisions maximizing what is best for them. So the probability of infection, the P, must be the same in voluntary and coordinated. If we add heterogeneity in the population, as we'll do in future work, then of course this starts being slightly different. But I can get into more detail that later in the talk. So if we look at the targeted response, now we don't have individuals making their own decisions to maximize their own well-being, but we now have a planner, which is the concept introduced by economics, of an entity that makes decisions for you to maximize population level welfare. So here we have this targeted response that emerges as an optimal solution that is flexible and restricts individuals to implement targeting. So the planner makes choices to do the best for everyone. And to kind of go back to what Kat was asking, in the model that I'm presenting now, the optimization is designed to minimize the recession while controlling the epidemic. So to highlight the coordination failure between the susceptibles and the infectious individuals, which of course is what we will see in a voluntary situation and what we see oftentimes in the relaxation of a blanket lockdown, where people race to contact and collapses this coordination between susceptibles and infections. So another thing that it's important here is that the risk preference actually matters and evolves over time. So now I'm going to show you some of the results of this like perfect world where we know everything and we comply in a voluntary scenario, which of course we know it's not the reality, but I wanted to give you the mechanistic channels that we work in, and then kind of throw a wrench in the model and start creating frictions in both compliance, test perfection, and lags in gathering information. So in this perfect world, in this world where we know everything, we can have several different outcomes that we measure. So here on the left, we are looking at the epidemiological evolution, so the proportion of cases over time, and each of these colors refers to the different types of responses. So the orange is the blanket lockdown. As you see, there's like a peak here, and then there's the lockdown is imposed around day 60. So we start seeing this sharp decline. The lockdown continues to occur here, and then as the relaxation happens, we see the typical rebound. So this is kind of like a sanity check for us to understand that the model is doing what it should be doing under a blanket lockdown situation. And then we have the voluntary isolation, which is, as I mentioned before, a situation where individuals maximize their own well-being and make decisions that are good for them. And then, of course, in purple, the targeted isolation, where we have this planner making decisions for the welfare of the population. So what we do see here is that because we are maximizing the recession control, we don't see much of a difference in terms of the trajectory of the epidemic when looking at the voluntary versus targeted under this optimal control function that we do in terms of controlling the recession. Of course, remember, this is a simple SIR model with homogeneous, somewhat homogeneous mixing that doesn't allow for a lot of the heterogeneity that would evolve should we have that. But for the mechanistic point of view, I think this is incredibly informative. But what we do start seeing is how the solutions in terms of loss, personal loss in terms of dollars, and the recession were at the community level, we start seeing massive decisions. So I'm going to walk you now through the average individual losses, which is dollars per person. So we see that under blanket lockdown, we have the highest loss in terms of dollars per person. And we do see, despite the similar progression in terms of the epidemic, we do see a very different economic recession or number of dollars personally lost between the voluntary and the targeted. And the next slide will identify exactly why this is. But I also want to work you through some of these metrics here. So of course, it's as we saw from the epidemic, through time, we do, of course, then have these similar evolution in terms of peaks and case numbers in these two voluntary versus targeted. But what we start seeing then is that economic metrics change dramatically. So the targeted isolation optimally coordinates individuals' behavior over the course of the epidemic, which then reduces the average individual consumption from the $12,000 under voluntary to about $1,000 in the targeted. So we see a targeted isolation that delivers a 91% reduction in losses experienced by an average individual who earns on average here $58,000 in a pre-pandemic baseline. So targeted isolations avoid sharp disease economic trade-offs, which we see here in the recession troughs and the time to recovery, and of course the economic wide loss. So this allows for susceptible individuals to continue to work, as you'll see in the next slide, that in the targeted situation, we allow individuals who are susceptible to go to work, and we actually restrain the individuals that are infected from going outside. So then carrying the economic through the epidemic with a much milder recession. So despite, of course, this not being a model that is completely grounded in real life, in the sense that, of course, we all know in this call that our epidemic progression does not look like this because of all the heterogeneities in the population and so on, in the networks, social networks, and so on. What we were managed successfully to do was to actually, in the voluntary isolation scenario, which is somewhat still slightly unrealistic, actually match the magnitudes and the timing of the economic recovery. So in the recession trough value, we see this 66.4 daily percent contraction, which if we translate it into a quarterly, gives us about 2 months recession and magnitudes similar to what has been reported, about 30% in the US. So why do we see a similar epidemiological evolution over time, but we do see a different recession consequence? So it all goes back to our contacts. So here we present on the left the normalized person hours. So it's the number of hours that number of contacts individuals have per hour. So this is a normalized scaling by population level choice. So individuals that are type S, so susceptibles, times the number of susceptibles in the population. So infectious type, actually, even though they're very small numbers, they end up having a huge impact. So what we see here that translates into that different consequence in the recession is precisely how the susceptibles are able to behave under these two different scenarios. In the voluntary isolation, which is the green curve, the dashed line here is the susceptibles. We see that susceptibles are staying at home because they are unable to process really the risk. So they just choose to stay home. In a targeted situation, the planner makes decisions such that the susceptibles don't really need to stay home, and thus are encouraged to keep their daily lives as constant as possible by concentrating in keeping the infectious individuals sequestered and quarantined. And that translates in, of course, the probability of susceptibles or recoveries encountering infectious individuals. So we now have, over time, this probability is incredibly different between one and the other, because the planner basically controls the number of individuals that are susceptible going to work and keeping the infectious inside their houses, quarantining, isolating. So even though there are fewer infectious individuals out in the voluntary situation, we have most of the susceptibles also out. Because there's still quite a few infectious individuals, we still have a similar progression, whereas in the targeted situation, that means that the path will not really change very much, even though the decisions are similar, because the number of infected is still high enough that regardless of that, you still have a lot of infections over time. So now comes the fun part. We throw a wrench in our model and we say, okay, so what happens if we ruin our model? World is no longer perfect. And now we have information delays, testing delays, and also the fact that testings, as we know, are not perfect. And in fact, the quality of the test changed as the epidemic evolved. So in the previous figures, we illustrated the key mechanism driving the potential gains from the targeted isolation, this coordination of allowing susceptibles to go out and making sure that infected individuals who were infectious had incentives to stay at home and remain quarantined. So of course, we know that in novel epidemics and in any type of epidemic, information is a problem. So underreporting occurs, compliance is an issue. So there's significant informational challenges. Individuals are often unaware of their own health status, and most importantly, they are unaware of the community burden. So these delays can be significant, and oftentimes the information, most of the times the information we have is completely inaccurate. So we're now exploring these lags here. So the model will again prioritize the key mechanism, which is the link between contacts and the economy, and this coordination problem that we have between susceptibles and infectious individuals. So in practice, when we implement targeted solutions, of course, the key assumption is that full information will not hold in early stages of the epidemic. So I'm going to go through some of the examples and then kind of try to extract really the key mechanisms at all times. So the following slides will have the same type of progression. So we have prevalence on the most left, followed by average loss, which is similar to what we were looking at. But now we're looking at two different things as well: the percent current infections and the recession over time. So we want to see how the recession is evolving over time. So in the first scenario we have a testing lag of 8 days and a test that 10% of the time returns a correct result. So 90% of the time it can be either correct or incorrect. So this means that individuals are often unaware of their own health status and information about the community burden. So at 8-day lag with only 10% results returning correct means that the test quality is so low that the planner can detect very little and ends up isolating many individuals that are actually susceptible and not infected. So, and it still allows a lot of infectious individuals to be out in the wild. What does that mean? That then what we see is that the progression in recession over time. So we see here that in orange, we have the lockdown, in green, we have the voluntary, and in purple, we have the targeted. We see that the recession over time is actually not that different. We also see the same in the current percent of infections in the population. We see that we do not see much of a difference between the voluntary and the targeted. And in essence, we see that the blanket actually works a little bit better in terms of number of infections, but still drives the recession to go further in. And that's translated in the average loss per person here, where we see still a decrease in the targeted isolation. So the recession locks down susceptible individuals, and in the voluntary situation, they choose to stay in, and thus causing this sharp decline, and thus kind of it almost creates a lockdown situation where the recession from the targeted and the lockdown is not that different. So, but what we do see is that as the lockdown is lifted, infection does increase as per usual, and now everybody is able to go to work. So the behavioral channel of people who believe they are susceptible view incidents and choose to stay in. So it creates this very weird balance between how risk averse you are and how willing you are to go back. So the difference is the ability that the planner keeps a proportion of infected correct, that are indeed infected at home, then becomes a problem because we are unable to really discern over time. So if we now decrease the lag and increase the accuracy, that's when we start seeing the bigger changes. So this is something we all know. And most of us in the community have been advocating for, even with the vaccination now getting more and more widely complied by, we still think that testing is part of the mitigation strategy moving forward now more than ever. So this is illustrating precisely that. So if we now have a decrease in the lag and an increase in accuracy, and people are able to understand their own health status and thus the community burden as well, we now start seeing that, of course, in our model, the disease progression does not change very much, but we do see that the trade-off becomes less and less. So 3 days in the lag matter a lot, especially in the transient dynamics of the recession, but we do see that the improvement in the timeliness has little effect in terms of the and above the effect of the improved test quality. So these changes in transient dynamics can reduce some of the economic changes. So we now see that the recession is minimized, with some, of course, some infection control benefits from the previous slide. So we now have a better scenario that is probably another important thing to show as well is, what if the test improves quality but the lag remains? So this is kind of interesting from a kind of a theoretical point of view, because we do see that the lag doesn't really have much an effect, but of course the testing accuracy really is the thing driving the idea behind if your knowledge is correct, then you are able to implement a planner that does truly coordinate between individuals. So again, going back to that value of statistical life, that trade-off between death risk and money, we now see that with information, the planner is able to truly make sure that susceptibles can go on with their lives. So we now see a big difference between the blanket lockdown and the target lockdown, and also most importantly, with this laissez-faire, I do what I want, versus a more coordinated fashion. So this is just a summary of that, where we see that this is kind of like the perfect world, and at the very bottom we have a bad test and a big lag, and you see that testing lag is not so much of a problem, but is really the improving of the test quality that allows for a more successful policy. So compliance is also a problem, right? We know that people are heterogeneous in their compliance, not because they don't want to, oftentimes it's because they are unable. So we know that in certain situations, certain communities, people are actually unable to stay home and are unable to comply with a lot of these mandates. Also some behavioral disbelief, but different channels will lead to the same consequences. So we can have situations where compliance is not perfect, right? So we can have partial compliance in the event of a perfect information. So as before, we have prevalence, average loss, current infections, and recession. And we're going to mostly focus on these two, and of course, focus on here. So here we see that in the partial compliance and perfect information, so here we have 75% compliance, and we all know what type of health status we have. The targeted isolation recovers just over 76% of the economic benefit from targeting in the baseline scenario. And we nearly all the infection control benefits. So what does that mean? That it's actually very similar with the lockdown, but we do see that the recession not only is not as deep, but also recovers much, much faster. And that also is reflected in the average loss of personal loss. So if we have a different scenario where we now have still partial compliance, but we have not perfect information, but improving information, now again, we actually have a very interesting behavior here where we now have the improving information in some scenarios can actually create consequences for individuals in some of these voluntary situations where now the trough, the recession can be bigger because it's susceptible individuals, when they don't have full information, actually behave, their behavioral response is such that if I don't know what's going on, I stay home, thus driving the recession further down. So just not having perfect information actually creates a hole much deeper than what we would have, and really exacerbating that coordination failure that I've been telling you guys about. So this is again kind of like a summary plot of different types of scenarios. And of course, here we can play with all sorts of heterogeneity here and different types of compliance as well as we improve these models that I'm presenting today. So just to go over it, so here we have max disease control and max economic gains, and we see that of course the perfect is always at 1, 1, the worst is always at 0, 0, but now we see that the closest to a perfect scenario is the partial compliance with improving information. So in summary, I think that it's really interesting for us to realize that targeted isolations do emerge from our model as an optimal strategy. Of course, in the situation where we were again maximizing for decrease in recession while still controlling the epidemic. So under a targeted isolation strategy, infection control does not have to come at a large economic cost as it is with the other two strategies. But of course, we know that this economic cost and the success of these targeted situations does rely on test availability and incentives for people to be able to comply. So correcting this coordination failure via the targeted strategy internalizes the cost of the infectious individuals imposed on the susceptibles and delivers economic savings. And what does that mean? That infectious individuals are able to stay home, so are able to comply, and susceptible individuals are able to frolic in the wild. Targeted, and as I mentioned before, our results are actually were able to match the duration and magnitude of the recession in the US under the voluntary scenario. And the drop in activity driven by the coordination failure means that the infectious individuals do not face social costs for their activities, leading the susceptibles to withdraw from the economic activity in this voluntary situation or in the relaxation after the lockdown stops being implemented. So finally, I think what I wanted to kind of have you take home is that there's an importance of testing, importance of accurate testing and widely available, which I don't think it's something that I need to convince this audience of. I also want to kind of start giving you a taste of what's coming. So we're now developing models that will incorporate vaccination and heterogeneity, but the idea here is still the same, right? These simple results still carry insights on vaccine deployment in the extent that vaccination limits infectiousness, so people are somewhat more protected. And our model shows that infectious individuals failing to isolate will still induce many susceptible individuals to withdraw. So if I know there's a lot of people and I may be able to stay home, I will. And so this is consistent with prioritizing vaccines to individuals that when infectious are likely or able to isolate. So incentives for people to stay home and protect them from others and so on. So using targeted isolation with vaccine, we believe is the way forward. And finally, by no means as a card-carrying infectious disease epidemiologist, I will not advocating that lockdowns are bad. In fact, we all know that lockdowns are important, especially in a novel epidemic where we don't have any information, but that testing availability really allows for smart isolation strategies and targeted strategies. And from our model, I think we are able to show that the disease economic trade-off are inevitable if this coordination between susceptibles and infected cannot be resolved, because in the absence of information, this targeted solution, this planner, can do no better than a blanket lockdown, which we have seen throughout our epidemic. And with that, I thank you for listening, and I wait for questions. I think I see
Great.
some.
Thank you for the talk. Yeah, there are a couple of questions in the chat. Do you see them?
All right. I think I'll start with Erin. I think she's the first one. Hi, Erin. So Erin says, given the importance of testing accuracy, what is the interpretation of the value of rapid antigen tests? Are they accurate enough to use in this targeted isolation strategy? So as you probably saw in our model, we didn't discern between the different types of tests. So we were playing with this kind of like rock curve, playing with specificity and sensitivity. So it really is, we can definitely play with these different types of how perfect the test is and how imperfect the test is in that case. And it will somehow, if I go back to here, so that means that, oops, sorry, I went one too far. So that means that while I cannot tell you exactly where it will lay, we can play within this testing lag and quality and kind of find out where in this space this test will be. And I think that we'll find that they're probably likely up on this right up corner. So I would think so. I think the idea behind our model is really to say that. So I see now Jacob Barhak. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. You say, can you talk more about the model calibration? Oops, I saw. What data did you use and how well does it match? So we used information from the economics literature in terms of hours per, like days of, pardon me, Hours you spend working and number of contacts that translates into. We used value of statistical life for the US. So that kind of trade-off. And we also used kind of census data for the US. In the part of the epidemic model, we calibrated a model for the parameters for COVID-19. Of course, that can change. So as I mentioned before, what we saw was that in our model, it matched the time for recovery and the magnitude of the recession. So all of the economics calibration that we did in terms of how individuals spend their time working and leisure and spending money was able to track what happened throughout the epidemic in terms of how many people lost their jobs, meaning how many dollars were lost and how much these people withdrew from the economy in terms of spending. All right, so anonymous attendee, whoever you are there any concerns about the equity of targeted isolation? E.g., certain groups will experience greater, absolutely. So that has been something that myself and my wonderful collaborators have been really thinking about. So the idea of allowing for individuals to experience greater economic loss by allowing flexibility in terms of how elastic your choice is to stay home is where we can start playing with that. So, and throughout the talk, I think I said a few times that these strategies will not work unless there's some sort of incentive for people to be able to comply. So when we were playing with the compliance, it was not necessarily to show that some individuals are misbehaving, but truly to show a little bit of that introduction to how inelastic some people's behaviors are. So as we introduce more heterogeneity, we can actually have a model for which individuals will experience greater loss or they are unable to comply unless there's some sort of incentive to allow them to comply. I hope this answers the question. But in our paper, we get into more detail on that. I think there's someone with their hand raised.
Yes, I'm David.
Yes, so if you want to talk, David, by all means, of course.
Thank you. Nice presentation. I have a couple of questions, a clarification, in fact.
Sure.
Number one, in your testing, do you assume blanket testing? And how would you deal with only partial testing, which seems more practical? And then related question, it is known that in COVID, a significant part of transmission is asymptomatic. How would you modify your system to account for this asymptomatic transmission?
Yes. So the one thing I think I alluded to it, but I didn't really say much. So in our model, of course, we don't explicitly look at asymptomatics or mild symptoms, but we kind of play with that in terms of economic losses. So we allow individuals that are that don't have symptoms to go and play in the wild, right? We don't make them quarantine or isolate. So we still allow for individuals who are infected or and infectious to play with susceptibles and thus carry on transmitting. As these individuals then either develop more symptoms, then we kick in and quarantine them. But it's really down to, I'm trying to see if I have the plot. I didn't keep the plot, sorry. I should have put a plot here in the presentation about that, but it's through the economic loss. Do I have it? One second, I think I have it here. Yes, so as we have more and more asymptomatic individuals, we are able to still track through the economic loss in our models. So we'll have we have the proportion of individuals that will still be able to mix with others and look at the ratio of consumption to labor contacts that will inevitably affect how much of the recession will be averted. But you are absolutely right, your intuition is correct, that if we have more and more individuals that are asymptomatic, then of course these economic losses will have to be adjusted. And we kind of play a little bit of that, with that in the sensitivity. You had a second question that I didn't quite hear.
No, just to clarify, in your model, your testing is blanket testing. In other words, you're able to test everyone. Or am I right? Or?
You are absolutely right. So, and why is that? Because we believe in a Miss Universe situation where everybody is able to do tests. Of course, that is not real. But in order for us to really understand the mechanisms and the value of tracking these tests in a situation that we could really map the contacts to dollars spent and hours of work, we needed to have a perfect situation where everybody would know their status. So now, when we start playing with the lag of testing and imperfect testing, we do have a way to now have individuals that don't get tested. So in our sensitivity analysis on creating a very imperfect test where 90% of the time we don't really know your status, it implicitly kind of shows you already what would happen if you are unable to get tested. But that's just a modification we can certainly do. I don't know if that
thank you,
David.
So
is there any other question?
There's one more question here from
yes.
Laura.
Have you considered doing Pareto optimization where you minimize? Oh, it disappeared.
Oops, I'm sorry.
Oh. No, I can go to the answer. Have you Pareto optimization where you minimize deaths and economic loss? So we have not, but we do play a little bit with hospitalizations in our supplementary materials. We kind of play with hospitalization and disease progression, and that's something that we will definitely do in the next iteration of this model as we add some heterogeneity. But you are absolutely right? So the idea is that once you have an optimizing function and you are actually able to match the contacts with dollars spent and hours worked, then we can maximize for whatever we want. And that's, of course, that's something that we should definitely do. Thank you, Laura.
Great. And on that note, I think we're just at about time. So I want to thank you for a really interesting and thought-provoking presentation, Dr. Bento. I know there are a couple of questions I was hoping to get at, but it's great that everybody else was so active and involved.
But Harry, please, by all means, email me and I'll be happy to talk. And Kat, if you have any more questions regarding the optimization, I would love to meet afterward at some point if you'd like. And that goes for everyone, of course.
So thank you very much. And we'll see you all for the next presentation in October.
Yes, thank you so much, Harry, again for the invitation. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.